In the brutal world of medieval warfare, knights stood at the top, wrapped in steel, trained from childhood, and feared on every battlefield. Their dominance seemed unshakable, until a compact wooden weapon began slipping into the hands of ordinary men. It didn't roar like a cannon or require years of training like the longbow. It didn't care about chivalry, honor, or class. It simply delivered raw mechanical power with the pull of a trigger. The crossbow changed everything. It was cheap, deadly, and easy to use. But more than that, it cracked the very foundations of knightly supremacy. In this video, we break down exactly why medieval knights feared crossbows, and why they had every reason to. Number 1. Explosive stopping power. One of the main reasons medieval knights feared the crossbow wasn't just its ease of use. It was the sheer destructive force it delivered. At a glance, the crossbow might not look like much compared to a massive longsword or a powerful warhorse charging into battle. But inside that compact wooden frame and steel prod was a devastating amount of stored energy, just waiting to be released with the pull of a trigger. Unlike a bow where energy comes from the strength of the archer, the crossbow stores all that energy mechanically. A military-grade crossbow, especially from the later Middle Ages, had a draw weight ranging from 900 to 1,300 pounds force. That's around 4 to 6 kilonewtons, terms that don't mean much to most people today, but for comparison, it's like pulling back the weight of a small car. And when you release that force over a short draw of 12 to 15 centimeters, it produced somewhere between 150 and 200 joules of impact energy. That's enough to punch a bolt through armor. Now imagine a knight clad in plate armor, assuming he's invincible on the battlefield. His steel breastplate might be 2 millimeters thick, and under that he's got mail, padding, layers upon layers designed to stop arrows, swords, and lances. But a well-made crossbow bolt, hardened and heavy, could pierce right through all of it, especially at a range of just 30 to 50 meters. The impact didn't need to be surgical. Even if the bolt didn't fully penetrate the armor, the force could dent the metal or crush bones underneath. At those distances, the crossbow became something far more terrifying than a long-range nuisance. It became a close-quarters armor buster. Knights understood this, even if they didn't speak in measurements and joules. What they did know was that standing too close to an arbalest meant serious risk. A single well-aimed shot could bring down even the most experienced, best-equipped warrior. That psychological impact was immense. It didn't matter how many years of training a knight had. The crossbow didn't care about noble blood, shining armor, or battlefield valor. It only cared about the laws of physics, and those laws made sure that if a bolt hit right, no amount of prestige or preparation could save you. Number 2. From civilian to killer in a week. One of the main reasons crossbows struck fear into the hearts of medieval knights was how incredibly easy they were to use compared to other weapons of the time, especially the longbow. Longbowmen, like those famously used by the English, needed to start training from early childhood. It wasn't just about learning how to aim, it was about developing a specific kind of physical strength and muscle memory over many years. Drawing a longbow required pulling up to 40 or even 50 kilograms of tension with the upper body, over and over, with consistency and accuracy. You couldn't just hand a longbow to a farmer and expect results. It was a lifetime investment in both time and effort, and only a select few could ever use one effectively in battle. But the crossbow changed everything. Unlike the longbow, the crossbow didn't rely on the user's brute strength. The energy wasn't coming from your muscles, it was stored in the weapon itself. The heavy steel or composite bow, called a prod, was drawn using mechanical aids like a goat's foot lever, a stirrup and belt hook, or a crank and winch mechanism called a windlass. This meant that almost anyone with a basic understanding of the loading process could operate it. You didn't need years of daily training or a warrior's physique. You just needed to learn how the gear worked and follow the steps. A merchant, a baker, even a local tailor could be turned into a functional crossbowman after just a couple of weeks of instruction and practice. That low training threshold gave crossbows an immense tactical advantage, especially for towns and cities where there wasn't a large population of trained warriors to draw from. Italian and Flemish city-states in particular made heavy use of this. Their militias were often made up of regular townspeople, not professional soldiers. But once the crossbow became available, these same civilians could be turned into deadly assets. A city preparing for siege didn't need to hire out a full army of expensive knights. They could arm their own citizens with crossbows, build some Pavvises for cover, and create a functional defense force in less than a month. It turned the battlefield into something much more level. Instead of nobility on horseback dominating every encounter, a row of shopkeepers behind shields could stand their ground and actually take down armored cavalry. From the perspective of the knightly class, this was both terrifying and humiliating. They had trained for years, spent fortunes on war horses and custom armor, and yet they could be dropped by a bolt fired from a guy who, a month earlier, was making candles or brewing ale. This shift didn't just change tactics, it undermined the entire idea of chivalric warfare. No longer was battle just the domain of the elite. Crossbows put lethal power into the hands of the many, not the few. That's why this rookie-friendly nature of the crossbow was so disruptive. It broke the monopoly on warfare that knights had enjoyed for centuries, and it introduced a brutal efficiency that no amount of noble blood or sword skill could counter. In the hands of an ordinary man, it became a nobleman's worst nightmare. Number 3, cheap bolts versus expensive knights. In the brutal economy of medieval warfare, nothing terrified the nobility more than how devastatingly efficient and cost-effective the crossbow was. War, for all its glory and bloodshed, was also a matter of numbers. And those numbers didn't lie. In 13th century England, equipping a knight wasn't just about handing someone a sword and wishing them luck. It meant raising a fortune. A single warhorse could cost between 20 to 100 pounds sterling, depending on breed and quality. That's not small change. It was the price of a small estate or several years of a craftsman's wages. Add to that the cost of full armor, which could run another 40 to 50 pounds, and you're looking at a fully armed knight who is essentially a walking investment, sometimes worth as much as an entire village. Now, here's where things got uncomfortable for those same knights. A military-grade crossbow, complete with 100 bolts, cost less than 2 pounds. That's the kind of disparity that sends a chill down the spine of anyone depending on elite cavalry to dominate the battlefield. Think about it. One peasant with a trigger and some training could eliminate a fully armored nobleman, someone raised for war, trained from youth, and financially backed by land, titles, and retainers. And all that for the price of a few pigs. Commanders knew the math. If you lost a single knight in battle, that was equivalent in monetary terms to losing 30 to 40 crossbowmen. That shifted strategy fast. Suddenly, high-risk cavalry charges against fortified positions or crossbow lines weren't just dangerous, they were economically disastrous. Every time a knight fell, it wasn't just a soldier lost. It was years of breeding, training, and wealth wiped out in seconds. And with the way crossbows punched through mail or played at medium range, there was no guarantee of survival, even for the best armored warriors. This grim arithmetic didn't just change how battles were fought. It reshaped how armies were raised. Feudal levies, made up of noblemen and their retainers, started to be supplemented and, in many cases, replaced by cheaper professional infantry units armed with crossbows. Cities, with their growing merchant class, could now field entire companies of crossbowmen for the cost of a handful of mounted elites. That wasn't just a tactical shift, it was a social one. Warfare was becoming less about aristocratic dominance and more about who could field the most effective force at the lowest cost. Knights, once the undisputed kings of the battlefield, were now vulnerable. Not just to death, but to financial irrelevance. The crossbow didn't just pierce armor, it cut through centuries of military hierarchy. And that realization, more than any physical threat, is what made it such a terrifying presence on medieval battlefields. Number 4, the Church's curse and the spiritual dread. In the brutal world of medieval warfare, you'd think knights feared only steel and blood, But the terror that came with the crossbow wasn't just about its mechanical lethality. It went deeper. In 1139, the Catholic Church officially declared the use of crossbows against fellow Christians to be sinful, even going so far as to call the weapon hateful to God. This wasn't just a casual opinion from a local priest. It was canon law issued during the Second Lateran Council, one of the Church's major global gatherings. This decree branded crossbowmen as tools of ungodly destruction, and for knights raised to believe they were defenders of a divine order, this was spiritual dynamite. To fully grasp why this mattered so much, you need to understand how closely intertwined medieval knighthood was with religion. Knights weren't just soldiers in armor. They were warriors of Christ, protectors of the faith, often sworn under oaths of loyalty to God, the king, and the church. They believed their battles were righteous, and that their deaths in war would carry eternal meaning. So, when the most powerful religious institution of the time essentially said, "This weapon is a crime against heaven," it shook the very moral ground they stood on. Think about that psychological weight. A knight could prepare his soul for battle, confess, pray, and ride out with courage, but still fall to a crossbow bolt, shot by someone with no chivalric training, no noble blood, and no code of honor. And not just die, be killed in a way the church considered sinful, even shameful. That twisted the fear from physical danger into spiritual dread. What if dying to a crossbow wasn't just dishonorable, but damning? Even worse, this fear wasn't baseless. The crossbow was a battlefield equalizer. It allowed low-born soldiers to kill noble elites from a distance, without engaging in proper combat. It mocked the knightly code. There was no heroic duel, no skilled contest, just a metal bolt slamming into a weak point in the armor, ending everything in seconds. And because the church had openly condemned its use, especially in Christian-on-Christian violence, any knight killed by a crossbow died knowing that the weapon that struck him was not just brutal, it was cursed. What makes this more chilling is that the ban wasn't about military strategy. It was about control and fear. The church feared that crossbows would unravel the existing social and moral hierarchy. If common men could kill nobles so easily, what did that say about divine order? What did it mean for the authority of kings and bishops who claimed their power came from God? The crossbow threatened to erase the spiritual protection that status and birth were supposed to offer. And so, labeling it unholy was a way of trying to put that genie back in the bottle. Of course, the church's ban didn't last long in practice. Wars kept happening, and practicality always won. But the spiritual stigma stuck around. Even after crossbows became standard in armies across Europe, they carried with them a certain unease. They weren't just seen as deadly, they were unnatural against the moral code of warfare. For knights, that meant every whistle of a bolt in the air wasn't just a threat to the body. It was a dark whisper challenging their very identity. Number 5. Battlefield Breaker. The medieval battlefield was once the exclusive domain of heavy cavalry. Armored knights charging in with lances lowered and swords ready were considered nearly unstoppable. Their momentum alone was enough to scatter infantry and tear through lighter units. For a long time, the dominant tactic was straightforward: break enemy lines with the brute force of mounted nobility. But that supremacy started to crack when crossbow tactics evolved, and one innovation, in particular, changed everything: the Pavvis wall. The Pavvis was a large, portable shield, often nearly as tall as the soldier using it. It wasn't designed for hand-to-hand combat, but for cover. Crossbowmen would plant these shields in the ground, kneel behind them, and reload in safety. This meant they could stay in the line of fire without being exposed, protected from enemy archers and even some cavalry charges. But the genius came when these Pavvises were set up in rows, creating a kind of wall behind which entire units of crossbowmen could operate in unison. This tactic flipped the script on how battles unfolded. Normally, knights would charge to break a formation, but now they had to charge through an alley of bolts flying at high speed, often with deadly precision. The Pavvis wall offered enough cover for crossbowmen to reload their relatively slow weapons while maintaining consistent volleys. And unlike longbowmen who needed space and years of training, these crossbow units could be assembled quickly and deployed with minimal terrain requirements. At battles like Montgisard in 1177, the effect was devastating. Fewer than 500 knights led by Baldwin IV, the leper king of Jerusalem, held off a much larger force thanks in large part to the precise, repeated use of crossbow volleys. The Pavvis wall allowed them to absorb and disrupt Saladin's cavalry, creating pockets where knights could counterattack without being overwhelmed. Even more dramatically, during the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212, the Christian forces used Pavvis-backed crossbowmen to disrupt the elite Muslim cavalry of the Almohad Caliphate. The coordinated fire cut through their charge before it reached the main line. The crossbowmen didn't need to kill every rider, just enough to break the formation, slow the horses, and sap the charge of its strength. Once the momentum was gone, the rest of the army could move in and overwhelm what was left. In both of these engagements, the combination of crossbows and tactical shield lines directly contributed to turning points in the large-scale conflicts. These weren't isolated incidents. As this method spread, the heavy night charge lost much of its fear factor. What once crushed armies now risked being funneled into deadly kill zones. Commanders began rethinking how cavalry was deployed. They added more infantry support and increasingly saw the value in integrated tactics. Not just brute force, but combined arms and defensive formations. And the Pavvis crossbow combination became a standard part of the military playbook across Europe. The battlefield had changed. The fear wasn't just of the bolt, it was of the strategy. Knights who once ruled open combat now had to contend with organized formations that could slow them down, break their speed, and leave them vulnerable before they even raised a sword. The Pavvis wall didn't just protect soldiers, it protected the future of warfare. Number 6. A royal shot remembered. It's hard to overstate just how shocking the death of King Richard the Lionheart was, not only because he was a powerful monarch, but because of how he died. The year was 1199, and Richard, known across Europe for his battlefield brilliance and larger-than-life presence, was leading yet another siege. The target was a small, relatively insignificant castle in central France called Châlus-Chabrol. The reasons behind the siege were typical for the time: disputes over treasure, loyalty, and local lords. But what wasn't typical was what happened next. During the siege, Richard, armored but reportedly without his full mail, was inspecting the defenses up close. That's when it happened. From the walls of the castle, a crossbow bolt was loosed. It wasn't fired by a seasoned warrior or elite defender, but by a young, unknown arbalester, just a teenager, later identified as Pierre Bazile. The bolt struck the king in the shoulder near the neck, a vulnerable spot even for someone in partial armor. It didn't kill him right away. In fact, Richard, ever the warrior, initially shrugged it off. He even congratulated the boy on his good shot and ordered that no harm come to him. But then came the infection. In an era without modern medicine, even a minor wound could turn deadly. And that's exactly what happened. Over the course of the next several days, the wound festered. Richard's condition worsened. What seemed like a minor injury from a low-ranking soldier turned into a fatal blow for a king who had faced Saladin in the Holy Land and survived countless battles. 2 weeks after being struck, the Lionheart, one of the most iconic symbols of medieval knighthood, was dead. The news hit like a thunderclap across Europe. This wasn't just any king. Richard was the very embodiment of the chivalric ideal. He was brave, martial, larger than life. The sort of man who led charges, not sat in royal courts. His death wasn't the result of some noble duel or grand clash of armies. It came from a single bolt, fired by a nameless, likely untrained boy defending a small castle. In the eyes of the nobility, this wasn't just tragic, it was terrifying. The symbolism of the moment was impossible to ignore. A young crossbowman standing on a castle wall managed to bring down one of the most formidable knights in history. He didn't need lineage, training, or fame, just a trigger and a target. For the knightly class, this changed everything. It suggested that their titles, their expensive armor, and their divine claims to rule didn't make them invincible. If a mere teenager with a mechanical weapon could end the life of a living legend, what did that mean for the future of noble warfare? From that moment on, the crossbow wasn't just feared for its raw power, it was feared for what it represented: a quiet, mechanical rebellion against the old ways of war. Richard's death was not just a personal tragedy. It was a warning shot that echoed through every armored camp and castle hall across medieval Europe. Number 7, the first step toward firearms. The medieval crossbow wasn't just a weapon, it was a revolution in how people thought about warfare. For centuries, the battlefield had been ruled by muscle, discipline, and elite training. Knights were at the top of that world, armored in steel and raised from childhood to fight on horseback with lance and sword. They trained endlessly, drilled in tactics, and considered themselves the ultimate expression of martial power. But then came a quiet disruptor, a weapon that didn't care about lineage or long hours of training. The crossbow, with its simple mechanical principle, completely rewrote the rules of war and, more importantly, laid the groundwork for the firearms that would dominate the next era. At the heart of the crossbow's power was one crucial idea: energy could be stored mechanically and released with a trigger. Unlike a longbow, where energy depended entirely on the archer's physical strength and skill, the crossbow offloaded that task onto the device itself. The tension was wound up using levers, cranks, or windlasses, and held in place by a simple catch. Once aimed, it only took a light touch on the trigger to release all that stored force in an instant. That shift, from muscle-powered to mechanism-powered, was a turning point. It made deadly force available to someone who didn't need to be a warrior in the traditional sense. That same idea would later be refined and used in the earliest firearms, especially the matchlock arquebus of the 15th century. Like the crossbow, the arquebus had a stock, a trigger mechanism, and a simple means of aiming and firing. But instead of launching a bolt, it fired a lead ball with even greater destructive power. The social implications of this were massive. Knights weren't just losing their battlefield edge, they were watching their entire role in society slip through their fingers. Their elite status was tied to the fact that warfare required years of training and access to expensive equipment. But now, towns and militias could arm regular people, blacksmiths, farmers, apprentices, with crossbows or guns, give them a few weeks of instruction, and suddenly those men could kill an armored knight from 50 meters away. No close combat, no valor, no flashy swordplay. Just a pull of the trigger. It didn't take long for rulers to notice that they could raise armies faster, cheaper, and more reliably this way. Crossbows turned war into something more mechanical, more accessible, and ultimately more deadly. For knights, it was more than just a tactical threat, it was symbolic. The crossbow challenged everything they stood for: honor, combat skill, personal valor. It introduced a kind of violence that was impersonal, even industrial. And when the arquebus arrived, that shift only deepened. The smooth transition from crossbow to gunpowder weapon wasn't just about tools. It was about a full-blown transformation in how societies fought wars and who held the power to win them. By the time firearms were fully in play, the knightly age was already fading. The crossbow had pulled the trigger on that change,